Arab Spring. Okay, first of all, what is the Arab Spring? The Arab Spring is a term given to the revolutionary wave of riots, protests, and civil wars that is taking place in the Arab world, which began in December 2010. So right at the end of 2010, all these riots and protests started taking place that resulted in civil wars, and what was happening was the common kind of government in the Middle East was sort of this tyrannical dictatorship, and the people there weren't getting what they felt like they needed. And so throughout 2010 to 2011, the Arab Spring swept across many nations in the northern section of Africa. So Libya, if you've heard about that conflict, the conflict in Egypt, Tunisia, which is where it started. And then it started to spread across the whole of the Persian Gulf. So that's when it started to spread to the Arabian Peninsula, Iraq, Yemen, etc. So this PowerPoint is going to be a little different just for this quick section right here. You'll see a question on your note sheet, which your first checkpoint question is right here because I thought this was a good thinker question right now. So just tell me, why is this event called the Arab Spring? That's kind of a funny name for this sort of event. Just take a second to answer that, and then we'll move on. So this whole event or wave of events started in Tunisia, which is this small African country, which you can see right here on the map. So it began after a Tunisian fruit seller in a small town ignited himself on fire because his goods were taken from him by the police, and nobody really did anything about it. So clearly there's a lot of corruption going on. The police decided to take the things that he was trying to sell. I'm not sure what their justification was, but he tried to get them back, and because it was the police that took them, nobody really did anything about it. And so he lost out on all those goods, and he was already probably pretty impoverished to begin with. So in protest, he lit himself on fire. And this caused anger and frustration in other citizens of the town, and so they protested, which escalated into riots and street wars between the police and the citizens of the town. So because of the internet and social media, protesters could record what was happening and then upload it to the internet for other Tunisians in the world to see. So this is part of that media piece, and also the fact that globalization is caused by this increase in technology. Because of Facebook and YouTube, other Tunisians saw what was happening in this town, even though it wasn't necessarily being communicated through normal media pathways that were controlled by the government, such as newspapers or things of that nature, television channels. So despite not being covered on the national news, because of social media, news rapidly spread of the events in Sidi Bouzid, which is the town that this fruit seller protested in and where the protests began. And so riots began to break out in Tunis, which is the capital of Tunisia. So in the capital, there was this uprising as well. These protesters managed to actually overthrow the current president, Ben Ali, and declared Tunisia a free nation eventually. And because, again, of this technology and connection and communication throughout the modern world in 2011, remember that's only 3 years ago that this is happening, news spread rapidly throughout the Arab world of how Tunisia managed to overthrow their corrupt leader. Your first checkpoint. So you already answered question number 1. Why is this chain of events called the Arab Spring? And that's the word I want you to focus on. 2 and 3, you can go ahead and answer, and then we'll move on. So after Tunisia, this revolution extended into other Arab nations because they thought if tiny little Tunisia could overthrow their government, they could do the same thing. Because remember, other countries in this area had similar strife, similar poverty, and similar corruption within their government. So the Egyptian people who were unhappy with their corrupt government were inspired by the events in Tunisia, and they become the second revolution in the Arab Spring. So the protests in Egypt began on 25th January 2011, so January 25th, 2011, and ran for 18 days. So that's pretty quick, and we'll talk about why it was so fast. On January 28th at midnight, so 3 days later, the Egyptian government attempted, somewhat successfully, to eliminate the nation's internet access. Now remember what happened in Tunisia. Even though the national media was controlled, that social media that's international, or extends all over the globe, part of our globalization theme, they tried to eliminate the nation's internet access in order to disable the social media to limit the protesters' ability to organize demonstrations. So think about Facebook. You send out a group invite and you can create an event. This event was called Let's Overthrow the Egyptian Government, and you could join the event, keep up with where these protests were taking place, and how they were going to overthrow the government on a social media platform that was separate and could spread throughout the entire country to gather support. So later that day, as tens of thousands of people protested on the streets of Egypt's major cities, President Hosni Mubarak dismissed his government, later appointing a new cabinet. And Mubarak also appointed the first vice president in almost 30 years. And you'll see why he does this in a minute. But the big part here is that they were also able to coordinate their protests in different cities rather than sending a letter. Think about before social media, sending a letter out to citizens of different cities and saying we're going to all protest at 4 p.m. on Sunday 2 weeks from now, and then maybe they change the time or something has to happen. That's a much longer chain of events. But this could happen that day. Tens of thousands of people could go out in various cities at the same time and show their protest. And eventually that caused him to dismiss his entire government, the president. So after 18 days of these nonviolent and violent protests, the vice president declared that Mubarak had withdrawn and fled to Saudi Arabia. So after both the Egyptians and the Tunisians had succeeded, other nations wanted to follow in suit. Checkpoint number 2. How did the government attempt to suppress the uprising in Egypt, and why were the Egyptian people unhappy with their government? So this revolution, after we've got Tunisia right here and Egypt right here, the next major country we're going to talk about is Libya, which is right in between the two. So in summer of 2011, the Arab Spring was at a high. Most of North Africa was following suit. Most significantly notable was Libya. And you might have heard this name, Muammar al-Gaddafi, the country's tyrannical leader. That's that word we talked about with the documents for the DBQ, tyrannical. He knew what would happen if he allowed the social media to be accessed in his country because of the precedent set by the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia. So Gaddafi blocked all websites such as Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, all those blogging sites. He tried to stamp all those out and put this extreme censorship in so that nobody could organize these protests in Libya. And so the situation finally seemed under control. People didn't seem like they could actually revolt and overthrow him. And so he started to feel a little bit comfortable, and he decided to unblock these social media sites, not seeing his people as a threat any longer, which was a decision that he would soon come to badly regret. Now that the internet was unblocked, all these young bloggers who had access to those social media sites were able to plan protests against Gaddafi. So finally, now that they had a way to connect with people all across the country and plan these protests and garner support, which means increase their support for their own cause, they were able to coordinate and organize the plan to overthrow Gaddafi. And you can see in our caption for this very plain flag, Gaddafi had control of Libya from 1977 until 2011. So that's a very long time. And that was sort of a theme in these Arab nations, is that they had this dictator from when the Cold War had kind of receded from the area until we came in, basically, and helped their people overthrow these dictators. So as the protests continued and gained strength, local militias, so kind of street fighters, guerrilla fighters, joined forces with the protesters and defeated Gaddafi's supporters. So it was a national army against this uprising army. So it was a civil war. So after his supporters were defeated, Gaddafi fled to an unknown location, and Libya broke out into a full civil war with the rebels fighting the government, and eventually the rebels won. Okay, last checkpoint. Only 8 questions today, and then you're done.